Hi, I'm Peter Jones, Chartered Surveyor, author and property investor.
I was asked recently, Peter, how do I make sure that I get the best return on my property? And on the face of it, that's a very simple question with a very simple answer. But let's just dig a little bit deeper into it, because the simple answer would be, if you can buy the property at the right price, which is probably going to be a bargain price, then that will increase the return from the rent. As rent's a function of purchase price, your yield or return would increase the cheaper the property is. But it's actually not as simple as that, because there's more than one return in the property. Yes, there's the rent, but of course we can look at the rent as a gross or a net, so we need to understand exactly what our costs are. We could have two identical properties with the same rent, but if there's different cost implications of holding those properties, then the net return from those properties are going to be different. So we need to understand our figures, and we need to understand the costs of holding the property. Another return which often gets overlooked when we start comparing properties is return from equity, and particularly equity which we can create when we buy the property. Now, if you've watched my videos, you'll know that my favourite model in property is to buy a property which I can buy cheap, but it's a property which I can also add value to, and usually the value is added by doing a refurb. A simple refurb, adding a new kitchen, a new bathroom, perhaps new windows, redecorating carpets, something like that, something which adds more value to the property than the cost of undertaking the refurb. And if you can add equity, either by buying the property cheap or by adding value through a refurb or adding value through some other way. By the way, there's other ways that you can add value to the property, but in my mind that's the simplest way of adding value. Then you can create equity. Of course, the best way of all is to buy the property cheap and then do a refurb and add value. Then you'll create even more equity. And that equity is essentially money which you've created out of thin air. Then there's a third type of return that we can think about within property, and that's the return that you're going to get from the tax advantages of holding property or owning property. So things have changed recently with the way that property is taxed. Section 24, I've covered this in many other videos, so I'm not going to go into it all again. But the very short explanation is that the government have decided that going forward, investors, landlords will not be able to offset mortgage interest against the rent when they're calculating income tax. So that applies to properties which are owned in your own name. So that means there's a distinct tax advantage now between owning properties in your own name and owning properties in a limited company, because a limited company still can offset mortgage interest when calculating corporation tax. So there's a hidden return there in the way that you actually hold the property. Other returns which you may be able to create through the tax system are, again, if you own the property through a limited company, there'll be legitimate costs, and I use the word quite strongly there, legitimate. Anybody from HMRC watching? I do mean legitimate things that you can actually offset through a limited company to reduce your profits, which in reducing your profits you're essentially increasing the return from the profit on the properties that you actually own. So all of these are returns. So it's not just as a simple answer as saying, how do I increase the return by increasing the rent? There's a lot more that we can do within property, and there's a lot more that we need to be aware of. And if you come over to my website, www.thepropertyteacher.co.uk, and click on Learning with Peter, you'll find all of the resources which I've created to help you to invest in property, including my home study course, the Successful Property Investors Strategy Workshop, in which I'll take you through how I created my property portfolio and my passive income, starting with literally none of my own money, but building a portfolio of £2 million worth of property in 4 years. Why none of my own money? Because I'd just been made redundant, and like many people in their 30s, as I was at the time, I didn't have any savings to fall back on. In the Successful Property Investors Strategy Workshop, I'm going to take you through everything which I did right and everything which I did wrong. Everything I did right so that you can copy it and do the same, and everything that I did wrong so that you can learn from my mistakes and make sure that you don't do it too. And in that way, hopefully you'll be able to achieve far more than I did, and far more quickly, and without all the wasted time, the wasted money, and the sleepless nights which I had to endure. So come over to my website, www.thepropertyteacher.co.uk, click on Learning with Peter, and until next time, here's to successful property investing.